You know what's funny about the moment someone calls you damaged goods after years of their abuse? It's like watching them hand you the loaded gun and then act surprised when you aim it right back at them. Let me paint you a picture of rock bottom, because that's where this whole beautiful disaster started. I'm sitting in my car outside a Starbucks at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, mascara streaking down my cheeks like some tragic Instagram filter, reading the text message that would change everything. Not the breakup text. Oh no, that ship had sailed 3 weeks earlier when Marcus finally got bored of using me as his personal punching bag. Emotionally speaking, though let's be real, he wasn't exactly gentle with the rest either. No, this was the text he sent to his buddy Jake. The one Jake screenshot and sent to me with a simple, "Thought you should see this." Dude, thank God I'm done with that psycho. She's completely damaged goods after everything. No man's gonna want that kind of baggage. Did me a favor, really. Now I can find someone who isn't completely fucked up. I stared at those words until they burned into my retinas. Damaged goods. Like I was some clearance item at a thrift store, marked down because of a few scratches and dents. The thing is, he wasn't wrong about the damage. 3 years with Marcus had left me questioning everything. My worth, my sanity, whether up was down and black was white. He had this special talent for making me feel like I was losing my mind, while he played the role of the concerned boyfriend, just trying to help his unstable girlfriend. Classic, right? But sitting there in that car, something clicked. Maybe it was the rage finally breaking through the fog of self-doubt he'd wrapped around my brain. Maybe it was pure spite. Or maybe I just got tired of crying. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and started laughing. Not the cute, delicate laugh of a broken girl. The full-throated, slightly unhinged cackle of someone who just realized they've been playing chess while their opponent was still figuring out checkers. Because Marcus, bless his small, predictable heart, had just made a crucial error. He thought calling me damaged goods would be the end of the story. His final word. The last nail in the coffin of my self-worth. Instead, he'd just given me the perfect motivation to prove him spectacularly wrong. See, the beautiful thing about hitting rock bottom is that it gives you a solid foundation to build from. And I was about to construct something magnificent on the ruins of what he'd tried to destroy. But let's back up a minute, because you need to understand exactly what kind of masterpiece I was dealing with here. Marcus was one of those guys who looked perfect on paper. 6'2", decent job in finance, drove a BMW he'd definitely overpaid for, knew how to order wine without looking at the price. The kind of man your friends would see at dinner and give you those approving nods like you'd finally figured out how to be an adult. What they didn't see was the way he'd casually mention that my laugh was a little loud when we were out with his coworkers. How he'd suggest I might want to tone down the personality because I was overwhelming people. The gradual way he convinced me that every natural reaction I had was somehow wrong. Too much. Embarrassing. It started small. A comment here, a suggestion there. Always delivered with this concerned expression, like he was doing me a favor by pointing out my flaws. You know, babe, you might want to think about how you come across to people. I'm just saying this because I care about you. 3 years of that shit. 3 years of second-guessing every word that came out of my mouth, every outfit I put on, every emotion I dared to feel in his presence. He had me convinced that my enthusiasm was neediness, my opinions were arguments, my emotions were hysteria. I became this muted version of myself, constantly walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfectly calibrated girlfriend who never made him uncomfortable. And the crazy part? I thought I was the lucky one. I thought I was the one who should be grateful that someone like him would put up with someone like me. God, writing that makes me want to go back in time and shake myself. The breakup itself was almost anticlimactic after years of slow-motion psychological warfare. He sat me down in my own living room, my own fucking living room, and delivered this rehearsed speech about how we'd grown apart, and he needed space to figure himself out. I just nodded. Didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't even ask questions. 3 years of conditioning had taught me that my reactions were always wrong anyway, so I went with complete stillness. He seemed almost disappointed by my lack of drama, like he'd been hoping for a meltdown he could point to later as proof of my instability. "You're taking this really well," he said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. "What did you expect?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know. More emotion, I guess." Even then, even as he was walking out of my life, he was trying to dictate how I should feel about it, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. I just thanked him for being honest and walked him to the door. shook his hand like we'd just concluded a business meeting. He left looking vaguely unsatisfied, like he'd ordered a 5-course meal and gotten a granola bar instead. The next 3 weeks were rough. I'm not going to lie and pretend I handled it like some empowered queen who immediately recognized her worth. I ugly cried into ice cream containers, stalked his social media like it was my part-time job, and called in sick to work more times than I care to admit. I kept replaying every conversation, every fight, every moment where I'd bent myself into impossible shapes trying to be what he wanted. The worst part wasn't even the relationship ending. It was realizing how completely I'd lost myself in the process. But that text message? That beautiful, revealing, incredibly stupid text message changed everything. Because suddenly I could see the situation clearly for the first time in years. He wasn't the sophisticated, put-together man who'd generously tolerated my flaws. He was a small, insecure person who'd needed to tear me down to feel bigger. And the damage he was so gleefully discussing? That wasn't some inherent flaw in my character. That was his fingerprints all over my self-worth. Evidence of what he'd done, not who I was. I started the car and drove home with a weird sense of clarity I hadn't felt in forever. Not the crushing weight of loss I'd been carrying, but something lighter. Something dangerous. Something like possibility. That night, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I looked at myself in the mirror, really looked, and instead of cataloging all the things Marcus had taught me to see as flaws, I tried to remember who I'd been before. Before I'd learned to make myself smaller. Before I'd started apologizing for taking up space. Before I'd let someone convince me that love meant erasing yourself to make room for their ego. The woman staring back at me was tired, sure, a little hollow around the eyes. But she was still there, still breathing, still capable of that slightly unhinged laugh that had gotten me through the worst day of my life. And she was pissed. Not the helpless, frustrated anger I'd felt during the relationship when I couldn't even articulate what was wrong. This was something cleaner, more focused. This was the kind of anger that builds empires. I grabbed my laptop and started making lists, not the desperate, wine-drunk ways to win him back. Lists I'd been making for weeks. These were different. Lists of dreams I'd abandoned because they were unrealistic. Lists of friends I'd lost touch with because Marcus found them annoying. Lists of parts of myself I'd tucked away because they made him uncomfortable. But most importantly, I made a list of everything I wanted to prove wrong about his damaged goods. Assessment. Because here's the thing about being called damaged goods. It implies you're broken beyond repair, destined for the clearance bin of life. But what if instead of broken, you're just unfinished? What if all those cracks aren't flaws, but places where light gets in? What if damaged is just another word for experienced, and goods is just another word for valuable? I was about to find out. And Marcus, poor, predictable Marcus, was about to get a front row seat to the most spectacular comeback in the history of ex-girlfriend revenge. He thought he was writing my obituary with that text. Instead, he'd just written the opening line of my resurrection story. You know what's funny about rock bottom? It's the most honest place you'll ever be. No pretenses, no performance, just you and the wreckage of whatever brought you there. And from that position, you can see everything with crystal clarity, including exactly how you're going to climb back up and who you're going to step on along the way. The first thing I did was take inventory, not of my flaws. I'd spent 3 years cataloging those, thank you very much, but of my assets. The real ones Marcus had spent so much time convincing me didn't exist. I'm fucking smart. Like scary smart when I'm not second-guessing every thought. I have a master's degree in marketing that I'd barely used because Marcus thought my corporate ambitions were unbecoming. I speak 3 languages fluently because I'm a language nerd, not because I was trying to impress anyone. I can make people laugh until their sides hurt, and I used to before I learned that my humor made Marcus uncomfortable at dinner parties. But here's what I realized sitting there with my laptop at 3 a.m., 3 energy drinks deep and running on pure spite. Marcus hadn't just underestimated me. He'd systematically dismantled every tool in my arsenal because he knew, on some level he'd always known, that if I ever figured out my actual worth, he'd be fucked. Smart men don't date women they consider inferior. They date women they're terrified might be superior, then spend years convincing both of them otherwise. Game on, you beautiful, insecure disaster. The plan started simple, prove him wrong on every single count. But as I dug deeper into what that actually meant, it evolved into something more sophisticated, more delicious. Because see, Marcus wasn't just wrong about me being damaged goods, he was wrong about what damage even means. You know what actual damage looks like? It looks like someone who's been through hell and learned how to navigate fire. It looks like someone who's been broken down to their component parts and rebuilt themselves stronger. It looks like someone who knows exactly how cruel people can be, which means they also know exactly how to be kind in ways that matter. Marcus thought damage made me worthless, but damage had actually made me dangerous. I started with the basics. My appearance, because let's be honest, that's where guys like Marcus live and die. He'd spent years making little comments about my weight, my clothes, the way I did my makeup. Always subtle, always framed as helpful suggestions. I'd internalized all of it, started dressing like I was apologizing for existing. Time to stop apologizing. I joined a gym, not because I thought I needed to lose weight, but because I wanted to feel strong again. There's something about pushing your body to its limits that reminds you what you're capable of. Plus, there's nothing quite like the endorphin high you get from deadlifting twice your body weight while imagining your ex's face on the barbell. I booked an appointment with a stylist, a real one, not just the girl at the department store who'd been dressing me like Marcus's idea of appropriate. I told her I wanted to look like someone who'd survived a war and come out victorious. She understood the assignment. But the real work wasn't external. The real work was rewiring 3 years of psychological conditioning. And that shit takes time. I started therapy. Not couples therapy to work on communication. Been there, done that, bought the t-shirt that said, "It's all your fault anyway." Real therapy. The kind where you sit across from someone who doesn't have a vested interest in keeping you small, and you learn to trust your own perceptions again. Doctor? Martinez was a tiny woman with steel in her voice who took exactly 1 session to cut through Marcus's bullshit programming. She asked me to describe a typical argument with him, and halfway through my carefully rehearsed explanation of how my emotional reactions had caused problems, she held up a hand. Stop. What you just described isn't emotional reactivity. That's a normal human response to being gaslit. Gaslit. There was the word I'd been missing for 3 years. I'd been calling it love. We spent weeks unpacking the techniques he'd used. The way he'd isolate me from friends by making me feel embarrassed about their drama. The way he'd rewrite history, making me question my own memory of events. The way he'd weaponize my empathy, making me feel guilty for being hurt by his behavior. He was systematic, Dr. Martinez observed during 1 session. This wasn't accidental emotional immaturity. This was deliberate psychological manipulation. That should have made me feel better, right? Validation that I wasn't crazy, that my instincts had been right all along. Instead, it made me furious. Because if it was deliberate, that meant every moment of self-doubt I'd experienced was by design. Every time I'd twisted myself into knots trying to be better, I'd been playing a game where the rules changed every time I started winning. But anger, I was learning, could be fuel if you knew how to use it. I threw myself into work with a vengeance. Remember that marketing degree I mentioned? Turns out, when you're not constantly worried about appearing too ambitious, you can actually use it. I started taking on bigger projects, volunteering for presentations, speaking up in meetings. My boss noticed. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but keep it up. This campaign proposal is brilliant. What had gotten into me was the radical idea that I might actually be good at my job. Revolutionary concept, I know. But the real breakthrough came when I started reconnecting with friends. You know, the ones Marcus had gradually convinced me were bad influences, or drama magnets, or just generally not worth my time. Funny how people he found problematic were universally people who'd questioned his treatment of me. Sarah was the first one I called. My college roommate, my partner in crime, the woman who'd been my maid of honor at the wedding I'd thought I'd have someday before Marcus decided I was too young to be thinking about marriage. She picked up on the second ring. Holy shit, you're alive! I was starting to think you'd been kidnapped. Something like that. Can we grab coffee? I have some catching up to do. We met at our old spot, this dive cafe near campus that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Sarah took one look at me and raised an eyebrow. Okay, what happened? And don't give me that everything's fine bullshit. You look like you've been through a war. So I told her. All of it. The slow erosion of my confidence, the way Marcus had convinced me that my friends were jealous of our mature relationship, the breakup, the text message that had finally opened my eyes. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression getting darker with every detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and grabbed my hands. I'm so sorry. For what? For not trying harder to stay in touch? For not pushing when you kept canceling plans? I knew something was wrong, but I told myself you were just busy or happy or, I don't know. I should have fought for you. And that's when I realized something crucial. The isolation hadn't just happened to me, it had happened around me. Marcus hadn't just convinced me that my friends were toxic, he'd made it so difficult to maintain those relationships that they'd naturally faded. Cancelled plans, last-minute changes, subtle discouragements, death by 1,000 cuts. But the beautiful thing about real friends? They're still there when you're ready to come back. Sarah and I spent 4 hours in that cafe. She caught me up on everything I'd missed. Her promotion, her new apartment, the guy she'd been dating who actually encouraged her hobbies instead of tolerating them. I told her about my plans, the slow process of rebuilding myself, the way I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time in years. "You know what's funny?" she said as we were getting ready to leave. "You seem more like yourself than you have since you started dating that asshole, even after everything he put you through." That night, I made more calls. Jessica, who I'd lost touch with because Marcus thought her divorce made her bitter. Mike, who I'd stopped inviting to things because Marcus found his jokes immature. Rachel, who I'd drifted away from because Marcus thought her career in social media was vapid. Every single one of them was happy to hear from me. Every single one of them had noticed my gradual disappearance and wondered what had happened. And every single one of them, when they heard the story, had some variation of the same response. "I never liked him, but you seemed happy." So, the pattern was becoming clear. Everyone in my life had seen what I couldn't, or had been trained not to see. They'd watched me shrink and fade and lose myself, but they'd respected my choices even when those choices were clearly being influenced by someone who didn't have my best interests at heart. But now I was back, and I was done being small. The professional transformation accelerated once I stopped censoring myself in meetings. Turns out, when you're not constantly worried about appearing too aggressive or too opinionated, you can actually contribute meaningfully to conversations. Who knew? I pitched a campaign that our biggest client loved so much they increased their budget by 30%. I volunteered to speak at an industry conference about innovative marketing strategies. I applied for a promotion I'd been telling myself I wasn't ready for. I got it. The personal transformation was happening simultaneously. I was working out not to meet some impossible standard, but because feeling strong felt good. I was dressing not to hide or apologize, but because I liked the way certain colors made my eyes look fierce. I was laughing at my own jokes again, taking up space in conversations, expressing opinions without immediately backtracking or apologizing. I was becoming someone I actually liked spending time with. But here's the thing about transformation. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. And Marcus, bless his predictable little heart, was about to find out exactly how much I'd changed. Because while I was busy becoming the woman he'd convinced me I could never be, he was busy doing exactly what small men do when they think they've won: gloating, and posting about it on social media like the emotional intelligence of a potato that he was. I'd unfollowed him on everything immediately after the breakup, but mutual friends were keeping me informed whether I wanted them to or not. He was out at bars every weekend, posting photos with different women, living his best bachelor life. The captions were always some variation of "living my truth" or "finally free to be myself." But the one that really got me, the one that made my jaw clench and my hands shake with fury, was a post from 2 months after our breakup. A photo of him at some upscale restaurant with a blonde who looked like she'd never had an original thought in her life, captioned, "When you finally find someone who doesn't come with baggage, Dacha blessed our upgrades." Upgrades. I stared at that post for a full 5 minutes, watching the rage build in my chest like a pressure cooker reaching maximum capacity. Then I screenshot it and saved it to a folder I'd titled Motivation. Because Marcus had just made another crucial error. He thought he was rubbing salt in my wounds. Instead, he was giving me ammunition. See, the thing about calling someone an upgrade implies that you have the authority to determine people's value. It suggests that you're some kind of prize that people should feel grateful to win. It reveals exactly how you see relationships, as transactions where one person wins and the other settles. But what happens when the person you've labeled damaged goods turns out to be a limited edition collectible, and your upgrade is revealed to be a cheap knockoff? I was about to find out. The plan crystallized over the next few weeks as I continued my own transformation and watched Marcus continue his. He was so predictable it was almost boring. Same bars, same type of women, same shallow look-at-me social media presence. He was performing happiness and freedom, but anyone with emotional intelligence could see through it. Meanwhile, I was actually becoming happy, actually becoming free, and the difference was going to be stark. I started documenting my own journey, but subtly. No direct references to him, no bitter captions about exes or fresh starts, just authentic moments of a woman discovering her own worth. Pictures from my promotion celebration, videos from my conference presentation, photos with friends, laughing until we cried, looking genuinely, radiantly happy. The contrast was becoming clear even to me. His posts looked desperate, performative. Mine looked real. But the real genius of my plan wasn't just becoming successful and happy despite him. That would have been satisfying, sure, but it would have been incomplete. No, the real genius was understanding exactly what would hurt Marcus most, being irrelevant. He needed me to be devastated by his upgrade. He needed me to be watching, pining, regretting. He needed me to validate his narrative that he'd traded up and I'd been left behind. Instead, I was going to make him realize that I'd moved so far beyond his league that he couldn't even see me anymore. And the beautiful part? By the time he figured out what was happening, it would be too late to do anything about it. I'd be so far ahead of him, so completely transformed into someone he'd never deserved in the first place, that his damaged goods comment would seem less like an insult and more like the desperate attempt of a small man to make himself feel bigger by tearing down something he'd never been worthy of. The foundation was set, the transformation was underway. All that was left was the execution. And Marcus, sweet, stupid Marcus, was about to learn the difference between breaking someone and forging them into something stronger. You want to know what real power looks like? It's not the moment you decide to get revenge. It's the moment you realize you don't need to chase it. It's going to come to you. And 6 months after that beautiful, stupid text message, revenge was practically throwing itself at my feet with a bow on top. I was at the gym on a Tuesday morning, mid-deadlift, when I saw him, Marcus, standing by the entrance, looking around like he owned the place, despite the fact that this was my gym, the one I'd been coming to for months, the one he'd never shown interest in when we were together because he preferred his exclusive fitness club downtown. I finished my set and caught my reflection in the mirror. 6 months of strength training, proper nutrition, and not walking on eggshells had done their work. I looked like someone who could deadlift your excuses and squat your bullshit. More importantly, I looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. He spotted me, and his face went through this interesting progression of expressions. Surprise, then confusion, then something that looked almost like hunger. It was the same look he used to get when he'd see something he wanted but couldn't afford. "Hey, stranger," he said, walking over with that confident swagger I used to find attractive. Now it just looked like compensation. "Didn't know you worked out here." I didn't stop stretching. "Been coming here for months. Guess you wouldn't know." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You look different." "Stronger?" I suggested because I was feeling petty, and he looked like he needed the help finishing his thoughts. "Yeah, good different. Really good." I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. This wasn't the broken girl he'd left behind. This wasn't the damaged goods he'd been trash-talking to his friends. This was someone who looked like she'd not only survived whatever had tried to destroy her, but had used it as fuel to become something better. "How have you been?" he asked, and I could hear the fishing expedition in his voice. He wanted to know if I'd been devastated, if I'd been pining, if his little upgrade comment had landed the way he'd intended. "Busy," I said, which was true. Between work, friends, therapy, and my new life, I barely had time to think about him anymore, which was probably the most insulting thing I could have said, judging by the way his face flickered. "That's great. Really great. You seem happy." And there it was. The confusion, the slight panic, because happy wasn't what he'd expected. Happy wasn't what he'd left me prepared for. Happy meant I'd moved on, which meant his narrative about rescuing himself from my emotional baggage was falling apart in real time. "I am happy," I confirmed, because why lie? Happier than I've been in years, actually. That landed like a slap, because we both knew what years meant. It meant the time I'd spent with him. That's awesome." "I'm glad." But he didn't look glad. He looked like someone who'd just realized he'd thrown away a winning lottery ticket. "What about you?" I asked, because I was feeling generous. "How's single life treating you?" "Oh, you know, it's good. Really good. I'm seeing someone, actually." Of course he was. Marcus couldn't go 3 weeks without female validation, let alone 6 months. The upgrade? I asked casually because I'd seen the post. Because I'd screenshot it and used it as motivation for the last 4 months. Because I wanted to see his face when he realized I'd been watching his social media performance. His face went white. Actually white. Like someone had just told him his browser history was about to be made public. How did you... Mutual friends. Social media, you know how it is. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I'd seen, how much I knew, how much damage he'd done to himself with his little victory lap. That post was... I was just celebrating? I offered helpfully. I was drunk. I didn't mean... Marcus. I put my hand on his arm and he actually flinched. It's fine. Really. I'm glad you found someone who makes you happy. And that's when I delivered the killing blow. Not with anger or tears or accusations, with genuine, radiant indifference. I have to get going, though. I have a meeting with a client about a campaign I'm running. Big promotion, new responsibilities. You know how it is. I shouldered my gym bag and started walking toward the exit. He followed me like a confused puppy. Wait, maybe we could grab coffee sometime? Catch up. I turned back to look at him, and for a moment I saw him clearly. Not the sophisticated man who'd convinced me I was lucky to have him. Not the cruel manipulator who'd spent years tearing me down. Just a small, insecure person who'd realized too late that he'd destroyed something valuable because he'd been too damaged himself to recognize its worth. I don't think that's a good idea, Marcus. I'm in a really good place right now and I want to stay that way. Because of me? He asked, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Because of what happened between us? No, I said, and meant it. Because of who I am now. I walked away and didn't look back, but I could feel him watching me go, and I knew that he was finally seeing what he'd lost. Not the broken girl he'd left behind, but the woman I'd become despite him. The woman I'd always been underneath all his conditioning and control. But the real beautiful part? The part that made me smile as I walked to my car? He was going to go home to his upgrade and spend the rest of his life wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his pathetic existence. The campaign I'd mentioned? It was real. A major client had specifically requested me after seeing my conference presentation. The promotion? Also real. I was now the youngest senior marketing director in the company's history. The meeting? Absolutely real, and it was going to result in a contract worth more than Marcus made in a year. I drove to work that day feeling like I was floating. Not because I'd seen Marcus, but because I'd finally experienced what it felt like to be completely unbothered by someone who'd once had the power to destroy my entire day with a single comment. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. Because 3 weeks later, I was at a networking event downtown, wearing a dress that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months, talking to a venture capitalist about a startup idea I'd been developing, when I felt someone watching me. Marcus was there. Of course he was. Probably trying to make connections, expand his network, do all the things he'd told me I wasn't business-minded, enough to understand. He was with his upgrade. And oh, honey, let me paint you a picture. She was everything he'd convinced me I wasn't. Blonde, conventionally pretty, dressed like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread about appropriate business attire. She had that vacant, agreeable smile that suggested she'd never had an original thought in her life, let alone expressed one that might make a man uncomfortable. They were standing by the bar, and she was nodding along to whatever he was saying with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been trained to find every word out of his mouth fascinating. It was like watching a masterclass in emotional manipulation, except this time I was on the outside looking in. The VC I'd been talking to followed my gaze. Friend of yours? Ex-boyfriend, I said casually. And his new girlfriend. The rebound. Something like that. We continued our conversation, but I was aware of Marcus watching me laugh at the VC's jokes, watching me pull out my phone to exchange contact information, watching me be the confident, successful woman he'd spent 3 years convincing me I could never be. I excused myself to get a drink, and of course, that's when he made his move. "Fancy seeing you here," he said, appearing at my elbow as I waited for the bartender. "Small world," I agreed, not bothering to hide my amusement. "You look incredible." "Thank you. That guy you were talking to seemed important." "He is. We're discussing a potential partnership." Marcus looked confused. "Partnership? For my startup. I'm launching a consulting firm. Apparently I have some valuable insights about brand transformation." I could see him processing this information, trying to reconcile it with the woman he'd convinced himself I was. The one who wasn't business-minded enough to understand his world. The one who was too emotional to make strategic decisions. The one who needed his guidance to navigate professional relationships. That's amazing. I had no idea you were interested in entrepreneurship. There's a lot you didn't know about me, Marcus. The bartender handed me my drink, and I started to walk away, but Marcus caught my arm. Wait. I owe you an apology. I turned back to face him, genuinely curious about where this was going. For what? For the way things ended. For the things I said. Which things? He squirmed. You know, I really don't. You said a lot of things over the years, and the text. To Jake. About you being... about the damaged goods thing. There it was. The acknowledgement I'd been waiting for. Not because I needed his validation, but because I wanted to watch him choke on his own words. Oh, that. I was angry. I was hurt. I didn't mean it. Marcus. I stepped closer to him, and he leaned in like he thought I was going to whisper something intimate. Instead, I made sure my voice was clear enough for his girlfriend to hear. You were right. His face went confused. What? I was damaged goods. 3 years with you left me pretty fucked up. It took months of therapy to undo the damage you did to my self-worth. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. This wasn't the script he'd expected. But you know what's funny about being damaged goods? I continued, still smiling. Sometimes the damage is what makes something valuable, like vintage denim or antique furniture. The wear and tear doesn't make it worthless. It makes it authentic. It makes it interesting. It makes it something that can't be replicated by someone who's never been through anything real. I could see his girlfriend getting closer, probably wondering what was taking so long. So thank you, I said, loud enough for her to hear, for teaching me exactly what I don't want in a partner, for showing me what emotional manipulation looks like so I can avoid it in the future, for breaking me down so completely that I had no choice but to build myself back up stronger. I don't understand. You called me damaged goods like it was an insult. But damaged goods are marked down because they're still valuable, just not perfect. What's the opposite of damaged goods, Marcus? He stared at me blankly. Factory seconds. Cheap copies that were never worth much to begin with. I patted his arm in a way that was almost maternal. Enjoy your upgrade. His girlfriend reached us just as I was walking away. I heard her ask, "Who was that?" in a voice that sounded exactly like mine had 3 years ago. Uncertain, slightly insecure, already preparing to be threatened by whatever answer he gave. Nobody important, I heard him say. And that right there was when I knew I'd won completely, because he was already lying to her, already minimizing, already manipulating, already starting the same cycle with someone new. But this time, I wasn't the one trapped in it. I walked back to my conversation with the VC, and we ended up talking for another hour. He was impressed with my ideas, my insights, my understanding of market dynamics. We scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss funding options. As I was leaving, I walked past Marcus's table. He was sitting with his girlfriend, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at me, and the expression on his face was something I'd never seen before. It was respect. Grudging, reluctant, but unmistakable respect. For the first time in our entire relationship, Marcus was seeing me as someone whose opinion mattered, someone whose success was worth envying, someone who had become exactly the kind of person he'd always wanted to be seen with. Too bad for him I was no longer available. I walked out of that event feeling like I'd just won the lottery, run a marathon, and solved world hunger all at the same time. The revenge was complete, but not in the way I'd originally imagined. I hadn't destroyed him or humiliated him or made him suffer the way he'd made me suffer. Instead, I'd done something far more devastating. I'd become so successful, so confident, so genuinely happy that his opinion of me was completely irrelevant. I'd moved so far beyond his league that he couldn't even see me anymore, except when I chose to let him. The damaged goods had become a collector's item. And Marcus? Marcus was still shopping in the clearance section, thinking he'd found treasure when all he'd really found was more of the same cheap, mass-produced bullshit. But the real beauty of it? The real, perfect chef's kiss beauty of it? He was going to spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he'd been smart enough to see my value before I did. And every time he looked at whatever upgrade he'd settled for, he was going to remember the woman who'd gotten away, The one who'd been right there in front of him, waiting to be appreciated until he'd been too damaged himself to recognize something real when he had it. The irony was fucking delicious. He'd called me damaged goods, but in the end, he was the one who was broken beyond repair. I'd just been temporarily out of order, waiting for someone who knew how to read the manual. And now? Now I was running perfectly, better than ever, and completely out of his price range. Game over. I win. The best part? I wasn't even thinking about him anymore by the time I got home that night. I was thinking about my startup, my new contacts, the life I was building that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. I was thinking about the woman I'd become, and how proud I was of her, how proud I was of me. Marcus had tried to write my obituary with that text message. Instead, he'd just given me the motivation to write my own success story. And this was just the beginning. You want to know the real plot twist in this whole beautiful disaster? The moment I stopped caring about proving Marcus wrong was the moment I proved him wrong completely. It happened about 2 months after that networking event, and it had nothing to do with him at all. I was sitting in my new office. Yeah, that startup I mentioned. It actually happened. Turns out, when you're not spending all your mental energy walking on eggshells, you have a surprising amount of bandwidth for actual success. The VC came through with funding, I hired my first 2 employees, and we landed 3 major clients in our first month. I was reviewing quarterly projections when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's someone here to see you." Says he's an old friend? Marcus. Of course, because apparently he'd spent the last 2 months watching my LinkedIn updates like they were his personal Netflix series. Every company milestone, every industry recognition, every photo of me looking genuinely happy. He'd been there, lurking, probably wondering how the hell his damaged goods had turned into someone he couldn't afford. "Send him in," I said, because honestly, I was curious what fresh desperation looked like on him. He walked into my office looking like a man who'd lost a bet with the universe. Gone was the swagger, the confidence, the casual cruelty he'd worn like cologne. This Marcus looked smaller, diminished. Like he'd finally figured out that calling someone damaged goods doesn't actually damage them. It just reveals how little you understood their value in the first place. "Nice office," he said, looking around at the space I'd designed to reflect exactly who I'd become. Bright, bold, unapologetically confident. "Really nice. Thank you." "What can I do for you, Marcus?" He sat down without being invited, which was so perfectly on brand for him that I almost laughed. Still taking up space like he owned it, even when he was clearly the one asking for something. I wanted to talk. About us. There is no us, I thought but didn't say. Because I'd learned that some statements are more powerful when you let the other person figure them out for themselves. "I made a mistake," he continued when I didn't respond. "A huge mistake. The biggest mistake of my life." I leaned back in my chair and waited. This was his show. "I didn't appreciate you. I didn't see what I had. I was intimidated by you, I think. Your intelligence, your potential. I felt like I needed to, make me smaller so you could feel bigger." I supplied helpfully. "Yeah. God, yeah. And I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry." Here's the thing about apologies from people who've systematically destroyed your self-worth. They're usually more about the apologizer's guilt than the injured party's healing. Marcus wasn't sorry because he'd hurt me. He was sorry because he'd finally realized what he'd thrown away. "I broke up with Jessica," he said, like this was supposed to mean something to me. "Your upgrade?" He winced. It wasn't real. Nothing about it was real. She was just easy. And you were everything. I felt something then that I hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, not vindication. I felt pity. Because Marcus was sitting in my office, literally begging for scraps from a table he'd walked away from, and he still didn't understand that the problem was never me. The problem was him. The problem was always him. "Marcus," I said gently, because there was no point in being cruel. "Do you know why I'm successful now? Because you're amazing. Because you always were amazing, and I was too stupid to see it. No. I'm successful now because I learned to trust my own judgment. I learned to value my own opinions. I learned to take up space without apologizing for it. And do you know when I learned all of that?" He shook his head. "When you weren't there to convince me otherwise." That landed like a physical blow. I watched him process it, watched him realize that his presence in my life hadn't been neutral. It had been actively destructive. I hadn't succeeded despite the breakup. I'd succeeded because of it. I could help you now, he said desperately. I understand business. I have connections. We could be partners. And that's when I started laughing. Not the bitter, angry laugh of someone getting revenge. The genuine, delighted laugh of someone who'd just heard the most ridiculous proposition in the world. Partners? I managed between giggles. Marcus, you spent 3 years convincing me I wasn't smart enough to understand your world. Now you want to help me succeed in mine? I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. You were. But here's what you're still not getting. I don't need your help. I don't need your validation. I don't need anything from you. I'm not successful despite you. I'm successful because I finally learned to believe in myself. I stood up and walked around my desk, not to intimidate him, but because I wanted him to see me clearly. All of me. The confidence, the success, the genuine happiness that had nothing to do with proving him wrong and everything to do with proving myself right. You called me damaged goods, and you know what? You were right. I was damaged. By you. But damaged doesn't mean worthless, Marcus. Sometimes damaged means experienced. Sometimes damaged means stronger. Sometimes damaged means authentic in a way that perfect never could be. I opened my office door. I'm not angry with you anymore. I'm not hurt by you anymore. I'm not anything by you anymore. You're just someone I used to know who taught me exactly what I don't want. And for that, I guess I should thank you. He stood up slowly, like a man walking to his execution. Is there any chance, any possibility that we could... No, Marcus, there's not. Not because I hate you, but because I've moved so far beyond who I was when I knew you that we don't even speak the same language anymore. He walked to the door and paused. I really did love you, you know. No, I said, and for the first time in our entire conversation, my voice had an edge to it. You loved the idea of me. You loved having someone you could control. You loved feeling superior. But you never loved me. Because if you had, you would have wanted me to be happy. You would have wanted me to succeed. You would have celebrated my strengths instead of systematically destroying them. And now I love me. And that's all that matters. He left without another word. I watched him walk past my assistant's desk, past the awards on my wall, past the evidence of everything I'd built without him. And I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not triumph. Just peace. That evening, I went home to my apartment, my beautiful, bright apartment that I'd decorated exactly how I wanted, without worrying about anyone else's opinions, and I poured myself a glass of wine, the good stuff, the kind Marcus used to say I didn't have the palate to appreciate. I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city lights, and I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, the one who'd been so convinced she was broken that she'd let someone else define her worth. The one who'd apologized for taking up space, for having opinions, for existing too loudly in a world that preferred her quiet. That woman felt like a stranger now, not because I'd erased her or rejected her, but because I'd loved her enough to help her grow into who she was always meant to be. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Drinks tomorrow? I have news about the guy I've been seeing. I typed back. Absolutely, but only if he passes the Marcus test. What's the Marcus test? Does he make you feel like you need to apologize for being yourself? God, no. He makes me feel like myself is exactly who he fell in love with. Then he passes. See you tomorrow. I put my phone down and smiled, because that's what real love looks like. That's what I'd learned from the wreckage of my relationship with Marcus. Love doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't require you to dim your light so someone else can shine brighter. Real love sees your damage and calls it character. Real love sees your flaws and calls them interesting. Real love doesn't try to fix you. It celebrates who you are while supporting who you're becoming. Marcus had called me damaged goods, and in his twisted way, he'd given me the greatest gift of my life. He'd forced me to examine whether I was actually broken or just unfinished. He'd pushed me to discover that what he saw as damage, the right person would see as depth. What he saw as too much, the right person would see as exactly enough. The woman he'd left behind was someone who needed his approval to feel worthy. The woman sitting on this balcony, running her own company, surrounded by real friends, living authentically for the first time in years, she didn't need anyone's permission to exist. And the most beautiful part? I wasn't even thinking about revenge anymore. Because the best revenge isn't making someone suffer for undervaluing you. The best revenge is becoming so valuable that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Marcus would spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he'd been smart enough to appreciate what he had. But I wasn't going to spend another minute wondering what would have happened if he'd stayed, because I knew exactly what would have happened. I'd still be making myself smaller, dimmer, less authentic to accommodate someone who was too insecure to handle the full force of who I actually was. Instead, I was going to spend the rest of my life being exactly who I was meant to be. Loudly, unapologetically, authentically. Taking up space, expressing opinions, laughing at my own jokes, and refusing to shrink for anyone ever again. The damaged goods had become priceless. And Marcus? Marcus was still shopping in the bargain bin, wondering why nothing he found there ever measured up to what he'd thrown away. Game over. I didn't just win. I lapped him so many times he couldn't even see me anymore. And that, my friends, is exactly where I wanted to be.